Hello, this video seeks to answer the question, what is the role of school in society? And this is somewhat of a common theme. It's kind of come up several times within the course, and it's questioning what does school or education do, or how does it affect society? And then kind of vice versa, how does society affect schools or education? And so we're going to look at some more specific examples or perspectives to consider. So, within your book, a quote by Thomas Jefferson stated that a nation could not be both ignorant and free. And of course, you can imagine where he was coming from with this on the cusp of, just gaining independence. And this is really about the colonial times that we've learned a little bit about when education was becoming independent, away from not rooted necessarily in religion, and beginning to see a little bit more of what we typically associate as education in school. So, with this statement and knowing kind of the historical element of it, as well as applying it to today. So, take this quote, pretend it's not from Thomas Jefferson, and think if it was someone today having said this. Do you think it's still valid? Do you agree with this? That can we as a nation, or as a state, or as a community in general, be both ignorant and free? Look at it even as a personal aspect. Can you as a person be ignorant and truly free? Um, and again, going back to our conversation before, does our education and the knowledge that we've gained through school help keep us free? Because in school we learn about different technologies, science, math, writing, and we use all these skills as we become adults, either in the military, working in businesses, those type things in the government. Do those in our education and what we've learned, our basic skills, keep us free as a nation based upon what we're able to do in our careers and in our protection services for our nation? And also, does our ability to critically think and create keep us a free and thriving nation? So you'll see with the Common Core standards, there's much more of a focus, perhaps than ever before, on critically thinking, critically evaluating, hitting this higher level of Bloom's taxonomy, being able to evaluate information. We've had the conversation that in the past we had to kind of scrimp and scrape for information, and now in our 21st century generation, we have a plethora of information, and we have to be able to sort through it, find what's most relevant, as well as find what is legitimate and be able to define how that is legitimate and use that information within context. So, does our ability to do all of that help us keep us a free and thriving nation? Because again, if we were not able to create and invocate, we would be doing the same thing we did 20, 30 years ago. Would that keep us free and surviving and thriving in this century, in today's world? And also, what is the school in general and in particular's role in this? Is this something that comes from, does some of this come from your parents? Does some of this come from society just in general, or indirected experiences that we learn outside of school? Or is this from actually what we learn in the classroom? So, the quality of today's education affects the society, the economics, and the politics of tomorrow. We've kind of established the fact that it affects society. The way that we think, the way that we learn to think, the perceptions we consider affect our children, and when they grow up, we're rooting in them how to think, what to question, more importantly. And so in the future, that's going to evolve society. It also affects our economics, especially considering what we teach and the jobs we prepare our students for. When they go to get those jobs, if they have those skills and that knowledge, they're able to create a better economy because of the job market. They're also able to create jobs that were not there based upon critically and creatively thinking skills. Also, it affects our politics. It may be that those people are able to question things. We teach students how to question and how to evaluate, and so when they become adults, they learn how to question and critically think about politics and issues within the government and authorities such as that. They don't just accept things at face value, which again could positively affect the political standpoints in the future. But based upon that, what ideals today do we teach? So if we're preparing the students for tomorrow, what ideals do we teach, and who knows best? And a section of your chapter kind of hits on what we've talked about before, which is school choice, and we see that that is becoming more of a reality. Why do you feel like school choice, or the ability of the parents to choose what school the student attends. Even it might not even be a private school, it may just be a public school. Why do you think that's becoming more of a reality? Do you think that parents want to choose the schools that best align with their viewpoint of their ideals, and so what should be taught? So more so than ever before, parents are saying, well, I really don't think my child should learn this, I think they should learn that, or I really don't think they should learn it through this context, I think it should be done this way. In the past, do we not see that parents were maybe more trusting of education and say, I'm going to send my child to this school and I'm going to trust that they're going to educate them in the way that they need to be taught to prepare for 21st century? Is there a distrust now and people are wanting to pick? Or is it just because in the past we didn't have that option and now that we do? Now, in considering that, also think of the question, who should be the person or group of people that picks what we teach? Who should pick the curriculum that is prevalent in public schools? Who should decide what we teach students, decide what the standards are? Do you agree that that choice is best left up to the parents, since they are the parents of the children? Or do you think someone else should be in charge of deciding what the children should know and what should be taught in schools? For example, should it be experts in subject areas? Should we have an expert in math, an expert in science, an expert in English deciding what a kindergartner needs to learn in English, what a second grader needs to learn in English, what a fourth grader needs to learn in English? Is it best left up to subject area experts? Is it best left up to politicians, which is actually what we see occurring now? Maybe the curriculum's not necessarily always defined as by a politician, but they do kind of have the final say-so depending on who is in power. Do they have any business doing that, especially if they do or do not have a background in education and understanding the teaching process? If they're from business, do you think that they should have a standpoint in deciding what the curriculum is, even if we as a nation have elected them? Also, what about curriculum developers? There are people who go to school and get degrees in developing curriculum, and so they're not necessarily experts in any subject area, but they're experts in designing and developing curriculum. Should they have a hand in deciding what is taught? What about teachers? The everyday teacher, should they have make a decision in what is taught? Now, granted, they're not curriculum experts, and they know a lot about their subject area, but they're not necessarily experts in it, but they do know the ins and outs of their children and their community and their district. So should they have a say more on a local level? Finally, there are experts also in child development. So just as we have experts in curriculum development, we also have them in child development and understanding what a kindergartner is able to do, what a second grader is able to do, what a fourth grader is able to do. Are those best left up to deciding what the curriculum is? Or do you think it's kind of a committee to where you have some curriculum developers, some child development developers, or some child development experts, some subject area experts, some teachers, and maybe some parents? Now, before you say that you think that parents should be allowed to decide what students teach, just take a second, and if you're a parent or if you're not, pretend that you are, and just let me ask you, what should a second grader know? Can you define that based upon research, based upon evidence, and do you feel confident enough being able to define what we should be teaching second graders specifically, not just in general, not math, science, social studies, exactly what about math, exactly what about science? If you were asked to write the standards for each grade level, would you really be able to do that accurately? So again, a lot of times people will say, yes, the parents should have a say, or they should have the say and they should be able to define it. But again, if they're not inclined to the information, it's going to be hard. Now, should they maybe have a sign off? Maybe should it go to a vote and allow the parents to view several different curriculums and vote on it? Perhaps. So those are just some different things. So as we discuss these issues, think about that. Now, in reality, of course, curriculum is decided by the federal government, the state government, and it's usually a good bit, it's usually done in a committee style, and there's several people involved. But in the future, we have to think about what is the best way to do this. Now, who thinks schools should change? So we talked in our school reform chapter a lot about change and what should be changing within schools and the different perspectives of change. And of course, everyone has their opinion, but you'll see within the realm of society, there are some people who believe in status quo, that the schools are pretty much the way that they need to be, or little adjustments need to be made. And you see, those are more on the conservative standpoint. Those who are more liberal or progressive happen to see that change is actually not occurring fast enough. So again, if we go back to deciding curriculum, who should decide curriculum. If you are more conservative, you may say, well, let's leave the curriculum kind of sort of how it is and just make slight adjustments. If you're very liberal or progressive or have different ideas about what society should be teaching students based upon our past, you may say, no, we need radical changes and we need them now. They're not even occurring fast enough. So again, if you have these drastic viewpoints, how as a society or nation are we going to be able to come to some sort of an agreement? A quote from your book is that the United States has developed the most comprehensive education in the world, which I thought was a pretty broad and bold statement. And it would be interesting to see data that showed that, but we're just going to go with this as a true statement, and that's pretty impressive for a nation. And also, what I think is that it's pretty impressive mainly because of the diversity of students that we have. In America, we have a plethora of disabilities, of minorities, of different cultures and languages, perhaps more than other countries. In other countries, it's more heterogeneous. You have the same people from the same background speaking the same language, so there's more of a level playing field. In America, remember we talked about free and appropriate public education. Everyone gets to be educated, despite disability, despite minority, despite difference. And so for us to have a comprehensive program considering all of these factors, I do feel like we're doing a pretty good job of it. So what does America teach? What makes it a comprehensive, what makes it so comprehensive? Well, we focus on creating literate citizens, which goes way back to the beginning of our society during our first national movement, when we first became an independent nation. The whole focus was to educate students to become good citizens. So we would give them knowledge, teach them how to read so that they could make good decisions as a citizen, perhaps in war, perhaps in fight for independence, perhaps in the future. And so that's something that's kind of stuck. We've also in the past developed moral training. If you remember, much of the beginnings of this nation's education was focused in moral and character education, a lot of it based in religion. Now, we've kind of pulled away from direct religion, but we still, especially within certain programs, especially character education programs, still develop some level of moral training. We also try to look at social stability, so try to incorporate what our society looks like, what it will look like in the future, and prepare students to think about and make decisions regarding that. Also, we try to educate students for high-income occupations. And again, we really push students in terms of academics. We prepare them to go to college. We have a great college system set up with lots of opportunities. And so we're trying to prepare students for actual occupations as well. Also, political socialization. It's not really directed, but again, we teach students how to think, how to evaluate, which is something they'll use in the political atmosphere when they're deciding who to vote for, when they're looking at people's agendas. They have to be able to use that. Also, we educate them based upon social injustices, which we still have today in our 21st century world, of what's not fair, what's not right, what needs to be changed. And we also try to, at some level, educate them for personal happiness. So what are you interested in? What will make you happy? What do you want to know to some extent? And again, that bleeds into multiple intelligences, teaching students the way that they learn best so that their experiences are positive in the education realm. Now, another quote from your book is, when society has faced an important social issue, the tendency has been to turn the problem over to the schools to solve. Now, this may be relatively new to education, and depending on how old you are, you may not or may have saw this in action, but do you agree that society's problems somehow bleed into or become a school issue? For example, we've looked at situations in our book. If there's health issues, say that recently we've decided that there is an obesity epidemic in America, and then so we've had changes to our health curriculum. We've had changes to our school food. There's been a drastic change in public school lunches to be perhaps more healthy. And so you see we have a problem in society, which is obesity, and it's turning into an education problem, and we're trying to fix it via education, via school lunches, health programs, that kind of thing. And we've looked at this before. This is not an uncommon thing. You have issues with illegal drugs in the society, so we try to educate students via moral and character education, health, those types of things to help them become educated to make good decisions. So our thought process on this is if we educate students early on about what to do, what not to do, and give them legitimate reasons why, when they become members of the society, they'll be able to change the social issue because of their new understanding. A question to be asked, though, is can education in the schools be the sole factor in changing society, or does it take more to change a society's viewpoints and behaviors? So, can we just hand it over to the schools and say, hey, give them school lunch, and hey, educate them in health better, and then by the time those students grow up, we'll change society? Is that going to be it? For example, I'll go back to my obesity epidemic example. If the students are given appropriate lunch at school, but they go home and eat whatever they want, or their parents have fostered in them eat whatever you want, or they see their parents doing things that are not aligned with that, perhaps not eating correctly, doing other things that are not sponsored by the school, are they as adults going to grow up and still do what their parents have done or what their background is rooted in, or is education going to be the sole factor in changing? So we've kind of discussed the issue of what level of influence parents have, and your background just in general, your friends, your society has on you. So education is just a small segment of society. Just by changing education, are we really going to change it? So just by giving health education and better school lunch, are we really going to change the obesity epidemic if we have fast food restaurants still providing it, if we have parents who are not on board, who are still eating and feeding their children in a way that is not aligned to the goal of education? So again, are we as educators and just education in general really going to be able to change a whole society's viewpoints and behaviors just through education? And especially considering even though the schools may be poorly equipped to do so. So not only do we have big battles to fight, but a lot of times we don't necessarily always have the resources we need to do so. So do schools have the resources? What other resources do you think they need? And this could be in terms of funding. This could be in terms of technology or textbooks or teachers who understand the content. Do we have teachers who are able to teach health and food services in the way that we need them to? Do we have the resources to do that? Do we have the funding to radically change the lunchroom schedule and what is fed to the students? Also, what permissions do we need to do this? So, and you've probably seen it in the news. When this occurred, when the school lunches were radically changed, there was a big upheaval and feedback from parents saying, you don't have any right to do this. We decide what we feed our children. You are just a school. You're here to educate them academically. You're not here to decide what they eat. So again, permissions. Does education have the power to do that? And it goes back to our previous question of, can education really make a difference if the entire society is not on board? So, what causes tension towards education? So, we've kind of talked a little bit about the conservative versus the progressivist. We've looked at if we're going to radically change the curriculum, we have to decide who's going to do it, and we have to hopefully find some consensus. So, why do you think there's some tension in education? Why do you think people just don't agree on everything about education? And a lot of times, the inability to solve social problems, including education, is based upon different generational conflicts and values. So you have to think about who runs education right now. The majority of those people are probably 40s, 50s, 60s. They grew up in a different generation than some of the parents who may be in their 20s or 30s, as well as definitely the students who are in their, early childhood all the way to teens. So based upon the generation you were raised in, your values sometimes are somewhat different. And again, this is a general statement. It's not every single person based upon their generation will think this way. But you have to keep in mind who's running education and making the decisions and who is actually being educated, and how do those generational views differ. And so, an example of that is the workplace values of the workforce, and we look at the different values of just working. And so, if you want to apply this to education, different viewpoints. So, those who are the World War II, so were born before 1946, which we probably don't have that many more around or actually working, their values were based in their willingness to sacrifice. They were very much in a hierarchy. You had a boss. That boss was everything. You did exactly what that boss said. They really were resistant to change. They liked things very consistent. They also were rewarded via recognition. That's what they thrived on, was to be recognized by that upper hierarchy boss. Then you move to baby boomers, who could possibly be the ones in the political realm making decisions now, because again, they are older. They've probably worked their way up. They're probably the CEOs, maybe the principals, maybe the superintendents, definitely perhaps those in politics. And their values are based upon dedication, working face to face, having a team orientation, focusing on the personal health and wellness. Then you move to what could possibly be many of the parents at this point and some of the teachers, which is Generation X. So being born between 1965 and 1980. So again, a little bit younger of a generation, more likely to be perhaps some of the principals, but definitely maybe the teachers as well as the parents of students. And their values are different. They believe more in a work-life balance, which is different than that of the matures and the baby boomers, who were all in, into work, into school, sacrifice, that kind of thing. The Generation X believe more in a balance. They believe more in autonomy. So while the previous generations were dedicated and loyal to one company, one aspect, focused on a hierarchy, Generation X like that independence, like being able to make decisions. They're more flexible. They are much more informal, and you'll see this actually as a conflict among lots of things in just the way that they talk, the way that they dress, the way that they approach. It's not that they're not being professional, they're just more informal than perhaps the matures and baby boomers would like or raised with. They're more inclined to diversity and global orientation, while again, because of the technology that was available, baby boomers in World War II are a little bit more isolated because they just did not have the ability to be global. So moving forward, we're going to look at perhaps our children, or the ones being educated, and maybe some of the young teachers now are going to be your Generation Y or millennials. And they have very different values in that they really actually enjoy having feedback, some recognition. So you see this coming back, some of these trends coming back from the matures. Fulfillment, advanced technology, fun, and open-mindedness. So again, baby boomers, again, are not as much open-minded, more team-based, more focused. And so you see a shift in being very open-minded, being technology-oriented, fun, light, which may be a little bit different than the Generation X, definitely different than the baby boomers. And so you can see, based upon where the politicians, where the teachers, where the principals, where the students, where the parents fall into, what generation they fall into, how their values in general as well as towards education will be very different. So we're moving on, and we're looking at pre-K, which is something that we've mentioned before, but your book does a good job of explaining the impact of pre-K. And so, as we've discussed before, Georgia has its own Georgia-funded pre-K, which is funded actually via the lottery. So go buy your lottery tickets, and it's actually fun. A portion of it funds Georgia pre-K programs. And if you have children that have been to pre-K, you'll know that usually they're within the school. Sometimes they have their separate building, and it's free. It's not a daycare that you pay for. It's not a private pre-K that you pay for. Your child can actually go to school to pre-K for free. That group, the Georgia funded pre-K, because it is Georgia funded, they are given specific standards by Georgia to teach, and that was the Bright from the Start curriculum. If you look that up, you'll be able to pull their exact curriculum. There are also other forms of pre-K, however, that they're able to pick their own curriculum. So if you're a privately funded pre-K, if you're a private daycare, you're kind of a little bit able to pick more of your curriculum. It's not as rote as the Bright from the Start because they get Georgia funded pre-K. But I definitely encourage you, especially if you're interested in teaching in pre-K, to look up Bright from the Start and look at their curriculum. You'll see it's drastically different than the Common Core standards. It's more focused on the collaborative and psychomotor domain. So you're seeing physical development, social development, those type things, where the Common Core focuses a little bit more on academics than anything else. But so our question is, what is the point of pre-K? An interesting fact that I read within the textbook is that more than one half of all nations fund the 3 to 5 year old pre-K. So I thought pre-K was somewhat unique to America, but it's actually not. Most nations do have some form of pre-K for 3 to 5 year olds. So, based upon our book statistics, we see that those who attend pre-K are less likely to be in a special needs class or a remedial class. They have lower dropout rates when they become middle school, high school age. They're less likely to drop out if they attended pre-K. And they have higher academic gains in math and reading throughout pre-K as well as their upper grades. So why do you think this is effective? Do you think it's because they're socialized very early to just the structure of school, to students in general, to education in general? Do you think that maybe they're able to be diagnosed or go through the RTI process early on so that they're able to adjust by the time they get into, a regular classroom? They're not necessarily, their differences are established so that they don't have to be in remedial classes. Either way, it seems that pre-K is a pretty good deal for our students. So let's talk briefly about religion in schools. And actually, your book details a little bit of background on religion and how it led to the rise of private schools. So in the past, when religion was sponsored through schools and schools kind of had a religious sway to them, that actually led to the rise of private schools, and particularly that of Catholic schools, because at one point, Catholicism was kind of traditionally, especially in other countries, a main private school, based religious private school. But in America, of course, we have more of a focus on Protestant values, so on Baptist, Methodist, those type things. And so if we do have Christian schools, if they are denominational, you'll notice a lot of them are Protestant based, and that actually led to more of a Catholic school approach. And you don't see it as much in the South region, but you see it definitely in the North. You see a lot more Catholic schools. And we still have those. And so, again, don't think that religion is not rooted in any schools. It's not necessarily in public schools, but it is definitely rooted in all different types of private schools. So we're going to look at the sociological models of analysis of the role of a school. And basically that's just we're going to look at 3 different models and belief systems of describing how schools should function and what is the school's role in society and what goals and approaches should schools take to educate students. Sociology, or the sociological modes, are all focused on how the schools affect the society, which affect culture, as well as how, again, the reverse, culture and society affect schools. So we're going to look at 3 different viewpoints, if you will, of how society is affecting schools or how schools should affect society. So the first one is the functionalist perspective. And again, as we read through these, try to keep in mind what your values are and what you support and what you think is important or not important. So the functionalist perspective's goals or viewpoints in education are based upon more of a status quo. So they are more conservative in that they kind of don't believe in fixing things in education or curriculum unless they're obviously broke. Now, some people would argue that things are definitely broke, and then some people would argue that they're not great, they're not perfect, but they're okay, and we shouldn't go radically changing things unless there's something drastic. So again, from this perspective, change is usually slow. They believe in slowly, incrementally changing things. They also focus on common values of the society as a unified whole. So there's not that much of a focus on multiculturalism, diversity, being your own person. It's more, let's take these people, even though they have diverse differences, and try to mold them a little bit to be, an American citizen, to be, to kind of have unified values. No, it's not trying to strip them of their diversity, but it is trying to say, yes, we understand your differences, but we have to come together at some point as a whole. And so let's educate ourselves as we can become a whole. They believe on rewarding based upon merit, so based upon achievement of students. So you'll see not so much looking at a student's diversity or giving them exceptions or accommodations because of diversity, but rewarding those who achieve. And their goal, their overarching goal, is to provide students, to create students who are able to provide for society via trained workers. So it focuses again in education for the workforce. Also, they believe in what is called social cohesion, which is what we talked about just a second ago, where people are bound together by common values. So it's more assimilation. It's not necessarily stripping anyone of their diversity, but saying, yes, we're all diverse, and if we look at each other as only by our diversity, we're never going to come as a unified whole. So they try to develop some level of social cohesion. So how is this evident in today's curriculum or what we might see? They believe that parents should be involved in education. So they don't believe that the school is the radical changer. They believe that parents absolutely have to have some influence. There is also a focus on the practical use of education. So, again, as we discussed before, a focus on preparing students for a career, not necessarily the affective or psychomotor domains or personal happiness or, debating social injustices or things like that. It's more or less a focus on preparing students for a career and a job in the workforce. Now, there are some criticisms of functionalism, and some of those are that functionalism does not address diversity, poverty, minorities, anything outside of the norm, because again, they're focused on social cohesion, not necessarily on individual subgroups. And also, there is kind of a focus on the sameness or standardization, again, social cohesion. Now, don't take that negatively per se, because again, it is standardization for the sake of cohesion and unification. It's not necessarily that they don't care about diversity or don't respect diversity, but they're acknowledging it and saying, but at some point we do have to be standardized to be measurable, as well as to be able to unify as a whole. Also, there is somewhat of a focus on academic achievement, and again, based upon merit. And they consider everyone kind of on the same level playing field. If you work hard, if you study, whatnot, you will be successful. And we've kind of looked at different minority groups and say, well, some minorities have a disadvantage because they don't speak the same language because they're from a different culture than the teacher. So critics say everyone isn't on the same playing field per se, and that may affect merit and achievement. And they focus on preparing students for work, again, not other issues, other viewpoints, mainly just getting them ready to have a career. So the next perspective we want to look at is the conflict perspective. Oops. And its focus is on, again, very somewhat drastic than the different functionalist viewpoint. And the focus is on believing different groups. They believe that different groups are constantly in a power struggle to take advantage and make the decision and have the decision-making power in education. So again, they believe lots of different people have viewpoints around education, and it's always a power struggle to be elected or to have a say so that education goes in your favor the way that you feel it should be. So they look at social class, race, and gender, different inequalities, which again is different than functionalism, but it's based upon who's in power. So if the group in power really believes in social class and race and diversity, then that will become popular in schools. If they don't believe in that and they believe in unification, then that will become popular in schools. So it's based upon who's in power. They also believe that the diversity among students in the poorer schools have less resources to support the low SES students. So you see a little bit of a cycle going there, that if a poorer school serves students with low SES and they have less resources, how are they going to ever be able to step up and move to the next level with those students? And then certain groups of students are at a disadvantage. So again, functionalism looks at everybody on the same playing field based upon merit, but then this one says no, that actually some groups of students are at a disadvantage because of the different society norms, different resources, and who's in power. So if somebody is in power who is in favor of middle class, upper class families, those who are poorer are going to struggle. And if society is set up to take care of those who are in middle class, those in upper class and poorer classes are not going to be, they're going to be at a disadvantage. So it kind of looks at the conflict among education, the power struggle there. So when looking at it today and into current times, you'll see that their current trends in education are based upon those who are in power to make decisions. So we commonly say that who's in power, who's the political power here. And when you see a changing of the political powers, you see drastic changes in education. When Democrats are in the office, you see education going towards one way. When Republicans are in office, you see things going towards one way. And again, that's just generally speaking. There is a cyclical process that those who are in high ranking schools will probably score high scores, which means they'll get more funding, which means they can get more resources. But on the other ones, those in lower ranking schools have lower resources, perhaps get lower scores, which means they get lower funding. So it's on this constant process and constant cycle that never breaks the chain there. So it's not really improving. They believe that gifted and talented programs favor higher social classes because of the different resources available to them. And this perspective focuses on multiculturalism and the differences of groups and people, and how multiculturalism and understanding diversity can advantage or disadvantage education. Now, those who are critics of the conflict perspective say that the conflict perspective ignores the trends that attempt to accommodate and make changes based upon diversity of students. So the conflict perspective is saying we're not doing enough to diversify, we're not doing enough to accommodate people, but we actually are doing a lot. We're not where we need to be, but we are making progress, and the conflict perspective really does not acknowledge that progress. And they don't acknowledge the fact that teachers do have a voice and they do speak out against political standpoints, because again, the whole point of a conflict perspective is there are power struggles and that people aren't aware of it and they're not doing enough for it. But actually teachers do stay abreast of the politics involved, and they do vote appropriately based upon how that politician says that they will affect education. Lastly, we have the symbolic interactivist perspective, and this is more of a focus on the classroom level. So the other ones focus kind of high level, society as a whole, education as a whole. This looks more at the individual classroom. And they believe that students develop self-concept via goals and interactions with others. So the whole point is on interactions with others that help develop your self-concept and how you view society. So two big questions that these group of people ask is, how does teacher expectation influence student achievement? So there's a whole focus on the aspect of being a teacher and how what you do and what you say affects student achievement, and a lot of times self-concept and motivation. So if we as teachers expect more, will students rise to that expectation? If or is on the contrast, do we per se expect too much, and that causes issues with student achievement, and the inability to please the teacher at any level. Also, the next question is, how is student interaction and expectation different based upon diversity and background of the student? So again, interactions, backgrounds is all rooted in culture. What's acceptable in your culture? If we define student interaction as this, this, and this, but it's based only on one culture, how does that affect those from a different background and diversity, and what is expected in their culture versus what is expected in school? Is there a disconnect there? So in this perspective in today's realm looks that if individuals interact with each other, democracy, social cohesion, and tolerance will be fostered. So again, we're focusing on individuals of different diversities interacting within the classroom, and that will foster a sense of social cohesion while being respectful of different diversities and having tolerance. Examples of this is mainstreaming special needs students in the classroom. In doing that, that fosters diversity in the classroom. It fosters tolerance as well as higher expectations for those students who are in special needs classes. If you're in a regular classroom and you have special needs, to an extent, the teacher still expects you to be able to do certain things, and it kind of raises those expectations. It teaches students of special needs or non-special needs to have tolerance and understand diversity. And again, there's also a focus on multiculturalism in the classroom because, again, we're fostering lots of different diversities, lots of different learning styles, lots of different ways to teach, and that's fostering the interaction so that hopefully when these students become citizens in society, they appreciate that diversity and understand how to integrate their beliefs with other people's beliefs based upon the different diversity apparent. Critics of this perspective think that the question that they ask is, do we focus on the interactions of the students and diversity, which is the symbolic interaction perspective, Or do we focus on the injustices of society, which is the conflict perspective? Or do we focus on preparing all students for the workforce, which is the functionalist perspective? So again, that's kind of the question that you ask yourself to decide which level, which sociological mode that you kind of support. And again, take the good with the bad, the positive with the negative, because both of them kind of have it. And this kind of all answers the question, what role does society play and what role should society play in education? A couple of more points related to school violence. Interestingly, in your textbook, teachers are actually citing personal safety as a concern for teachers. So why you want to get into the field, why do you not want to get into the field? Teachers are actually sometimes citing personal safety as reasons not to get into the field because of the media perspective of school violence. Now, actually, school violence only occurs within 10% of schools, and so it's not that common, but again, the media really publicizes it. 20% of middle school and high school students have cited seeing a violent crime at school, however, which is a little bit alarming to me. But this is not a new phenomenon. A quote from your book is in 1837, so we're talking quite a while ago. More than 300 students in Massachusetts alone were disrupted by rebellious students. And your book kind of details some of the rebellious things in acting out things that students did back then. Probably not as severe as they do now, but there were behavioral issues. So you may hear people say there was a golden age of behavior or a golden age of education. And there was not. Every generation had struggles, some of which are the same. We are still trying to get behavioral management down pat. We are still trying to get academics down pat. It's always been an issue. And while society changes and issues develop, these issues are not new. And it's not that we've ever had a golden age where education was perfect. Some facts about teachers that your book details. One is that in the past, teachers have not been viewed as the teaching practice has not been viewed as intellectually challenging. So I'm sure that you've heard it as a student. Well, if you have graduated from elementary school, surely you can teach elementary school, which we know, and again, we've discussed in a couple of the chapters that is very untrue, but that's how the public sees teaching sometimes. Teacher salaries do not indicate a respect for the profession. Teachers are not paid nearly as much as other professions with the same level of degree, a bachelor's degree or whatnot. So that may indicate that there's not as much respect for teachers. 85% of teachers are female, so there's definitely not a lot of representation from the male population. And 50% of teachers leave the profession within the first 5 years of teaching, which I find to be pretty much shocking. Half of the teachers who become teachers leave the profession within the first 5 years. Also, there is a focus on subject area development rather than teaching methods. So you see a lot of colleges, a lot of professional development focus on teaching teachers the subject content, not necessarily how to teach the content. So, looking at all these facts, what does this say about the society's viewpoint of teachers? Obviously, the salary issue, the perspective issue, the issue of focusing more on subject area than the act of teaching, those are some issues that kind of give us an idea of what society views about teachers. So, are schools failing? Here's the question. We have to be very careful with the data, and we've kind of already talked about this before. Media really pushes out that schools are failing. We're not doing as well. We're not doing as well as we have in the past. We're not doing as well as with other countries. And that's not necessarily true. You have to be careful with your statistics. So, your book details that overall SAT scores from 1981 to 2002 have stayed the same. And so you may say, well, that's terrible. We haven't increased from 1981 to 2002. But if you further delineate, each subgroup scores have increased. Minority subgroup scores have increased. Female subject scores have increased from 1981 to 2002. So it's not something that is completely foreign. We have increased. It's just something that we've had to be very careful with our statistics. Also, minority groups may appear higher but in the past, but less minorities took subject tests in 1981. So you have to think, we can't really compare minority scores because 20, 30 years ago, we did not have as many minorities, so they were not there to take the test. Also, other nations, you have to be careful because, again, as we talked before, other nations may not have as much diversity as we have. Also, not all students attend schools or college in other nations, and they surely don't take the SAT. So if we're only looking at a certain subpopulation, the highest scoring subpopulation, in other nations that took the test and we're comparing it to our entire population in America, of course our scores are going to be lower. If everybody took the test in another nation and we compared it to everybody who took it in America, we may have comparable scores. So again, you have to be very careful with the data and look at where it's coming from and what it's measuring. Because again, the data actually shows that schools are actually not failing in general. If you further delineate and look specifically at the scores, it's not really that schools just in general are failing, but they are saying that we do need to do a better job of educating, accommodating, and providing resources for minority students. So we're doing a good job overall, but we do need to help and focus on minority students and those in lower SES populations. And that covers some of the aspects and considerations we have when we are looking at the role of the school in society.